Great to be here, by the way. It's a labor of love that has produced it, and it's amazing. First time I heard that this was going to happen, this was not the location, but it's amazing. I wish every city had at least 2 or 3 places like this. That would be the best. Okay, well, this is a pocket-sized book, and it's to be treated like that. It's a book that I wrote because I thought that a certain argument was being lost over the Arab Spring, and I wanted to make the argument that I think was being lost and may have been lost already. So it's a good idea to write for, just to keep the argument there in print. And thankfully, one crazy publisher in the United States decided to publish it, and of course, Leftward is crazy enough to publish it. I thought I'd share with you maybe 3, maybe 4 different broad points, and then we can have a conversation. The first is, how did this Arab Spring appear? I'll tell you that. I put that in my own understanding of the context. The second basic thing is, what is America up to? That's the second basic thing, or you might rephrase that as, what is America's problem? That's the second. The third is, Gaddafi? Question mark. How is it that people actually thought Gaddafi was a hero? Question mark. And then what happened in Libya? And the fourth, I think, a little bit we can enter Syria, because it's the sort of next chapter I didn't write. Okay, so those would be the themes. When the Arab Spring broke out, let's say, the Arab Spring as a term is a very useful term. There was a big debate. People said, why are you calling it the Arab Spring? What about the African movements? And I'll come to that in a moment. And why spring? Whose weather cycle are we adopting? Spring, summer. After all, in India there's only one season. It's called the monsoon, Mazin, the season. We don't have it anymore, but it's India season. Now the season is Garni. So people say, don't call this wrong, but I think that was a superficial critique, and I'll come to why I think that is the case. So you had this thing break out in December of the previous year, in 2010 December. Movement sort of began somewhat in Tunisia, very in Egypt. Almost rapidly, the NATO press in Europe and the United States began to take credit for what was going on, especially after Ben Ali had been deposed from Tunisia and Mubarak went to the seaside. The NATO press started to say that this has something to do with America or Europe, even though right till the very end, the French tried to prevent Ben Ali's ouster from Tunisia, and right till the end, the Americans tried to prevent Mubarak's ouster from Egypt. So they began to say, look, this has to do with technology. It has to do with Facebook or Twitter. Arabs are not capable of revolution. It had to be Americans. They produced the techniques, and the Arabs were unwittingly being driven along by American technology. Or there was a very large story that circulated that there's an American professor called Gene Sharp who wrote a book about nonviolent resistance. It was translated into Arabic about 4 years ago, and it was Gene Sharp who did it. It's not the Egyptians. Again, they were just bit actors in this play. Absurd idea that the Arab Spring came from outside. And then later people will say this is a CIA conspiracy, to come and dominate the region. Absurd idea. Actually, the Arab Spring has to be rooted in at least 15 years of organized struggle in Tunisia and Egypt. Just taking these two as an example. Egypt is the best example. Egypt's Tahrir Square didn't come out of a call from Facebook and then random people showed up and then the random people kept coming back. It was a deeply organized affair. So who was in there? Labor unions. People who had been fighting in places like Mahalla. 20,000 textile workers strikes. 30,000 textile workers on strike. And I'm not talking about 2010, 2011, I'm talking about 2006, 2001. In the 1990s, textile workers had been militant in Egypt. Anti-neoliberal policies that had come in through the Mubarak regime. So textile workers. Then my favorite trade union in Egypt is called the Union of Tax Workers. Now you might think these are like people who work in the tax department. But no, these are state employees. In other words, they get paid by taxes. So they're tax workers. It's the only independent union in Egypt until recently. So they were very fierce in combating the cutbacks of public sector employees over the last 10-year period. So they were in there. Who else was in there? Association of Sequestered Workers was in there. Who else? A platform that was created in solidarity with the Second Intifada, Palestinian. A lot of the young people were part of these March 6 movement, Kafia, these movements which were solidarity movements with the Palestinian Second Intifada, 2000. That was the big youth contingent. Second major youth contingent was created out of the massive demonstration in Egypt, in Cairo and in Alexandria in 2003 in opposition to the Second Gulf War. They had a platform, April 6th. You know, these were the names of the coalition. Those dates refer to something. March movement, April movement, they refer to these mobilizations. That's who was in the square. That's who was fighting in Alexandria, because when Khalid Said was killed, middle class youth was stabbed to death in the streets of Alexandria, the movement begins in Alexandria. Alexandria was much more progressive and radical. It radicalized faster than Cairo. The workers in Suez were on strike. These people weren't using Facebook. In fact, Facebook was closed down. Internet was closed down in January by Mubarak's regime, and the days after that, Tahrir was bigger. So the illusion of Facebook, Twitter, American methods of organizing is completely absent the realities of the dynamic. In Tunisia, it was mine workers. In the two major mine working towns, they were the first spur. Bouazizi's immolation was important, but there was also the old struggles of mine workers that played a crucial role in bringing people to the streets. Okay, so that's the first thing. The Arab Spring is authentic movement from below, which comes out of all these agglomeration of movements. But what were they fighting against? They were fighting against an interesting combination. That at least during the national liberation period, even though personal and political freedoms were minimum, those states followed economic policies that subsidized basic necessity for the population. So bread was subsidized, water delivery was subsidized, housing was subsidized. So people said, okay, fine, we can't go and demonstrate easily against the regime, but we're getting these basic needs taken care of. By the way, the last time masses of people entered Tahrir Square was in 1967. That time they entered Tahrir Square not to say Nasser go to Sharm el-Sheikh, but they entered Tahrir Square to say Nasser don't resign. Because after the defeat in 67, he threatened to resign. So the regime was relatively popular, the old regime, the Ancien regime, the regime of Nasserism, high Nasserism. From Sadat onward, and the same story is in Tunisia, from the late 70s onward, early 70s onward, there was a move to change the basis of the economy. And by Mubarak, just in Egypt, all those subsidies had disappeared. Bread subsidy being the first one. Bread subsidy disappeared, housing, water, all these basic issues had been taken off the table. Everything was getting privatized. And the gangster conducting the privatization was Mubarak's son, Gamal Mubarak. Greatly hated figure. So this dynamic had happened, but the national security state had not been changed. So now you had the worst of both worlds. You had neither subsidized goods coming to you, nor did you have political freedoms. So the real thrust of these demonstrations over the last 15 years were against two pillars. They were against the authoritarian state, totally. And they were against the neoliberal economic policies. So it was very clear that one of the pushes in the Gulf demonstration of 2003, many of the slogans were about Mubarak, even though they were not directly against Mubarak. Because it was very dangerous to do that kind of thing. People spoke about the role of imperialism in prisons. When the rendition program was revealed, it was revealed that prisoners caught by the United States in Afghanistan and wherever the hell they found people in Malaysia, they would take them to the so-called black prisons. Where were these prisons? They were in Egypt, they were in Libya, they were in Syria, and they were being tortured by these regimes with CIA and MI6 people in the jails. That's how they were getting a lot of their information. They couldn't torture them in Guantanamo, they could waterboard them, but the Syrian regime, the Egyptian regime, Libyan regime, these guys are past masters in proper torture. Stretching the body, all the medieval stuff that one can see in museums, they were using them all. So the Americans didn't want to do this stuff in Guantanamo because they have certain scruples, so they handed over people to the Egyptians. Egyptians, led by Omar Suleiman, who recently died, real gangster. So these guys knew the demonstrations had been saying over the last few years, stop this prison regime. So many of our people in prison. I forgot to mention in Tahrir, of course, the Ikhwan was there, the Muslim Brotherhood, who had experienced the prisons as much as anybody. The left movement had been decimated under Nasserism and then destroyed under Sadat. So this was a kind of vast coalition that created the Arab Spring. That's the first part. I said very quickly the Arab Spring. I go over that in some detail, the Tunisian story, etc. Second question, what's the Americans' problem? After all, using Facebook, Gene Sharp's manual, people were rising, they wanted the dictators to go, this bloody discourse of human rights has been going on and on. People were taking it seriously. They said, we want freedom, we want to have elections. Okay, the great thing, America's greatest gift to the world, it seems, is elections. They wanted elections. But this was not to be allowed. And in Egypt, the story again is clearest. Obama, see, to be a woman ambassador in the American regime is a very difficult job. Because there are all these examples, Ann Patterson in Pakistan, Margaret Scobie in Egypt, all these examples of very senior women in the State Department who are ambassadors who get sidelined in a crisis. So just as in the crisis in Pakistan, they sideline Ann Patterson and throw in the immense bulk of Richard Holbrooke. He came in as a special envoy. Sideline the ambassador. The ambassador suddenly of no consequence. She was not even in the meetings, the important meetings. In Egypt, Margaret Scobie, very good ambassador, liberal person, sideline, they sent in Frank Wisner Jr. Now, he is our old friend. He used to be the ambassador in New Delhi. You may remember him. This guy is a gangster of the highest order. Mubarak's pal, very close friends when he was ambassador to Egypt. In fact, during Gulf War I, he was the conduit to make sure Egypt came along with the West to be part of the so-called coalition against Saddam Hussein in 1990-91. By the way, anybody else know which other Arab country actually sent troops? Yeah, there's... You can sit beside me. Okay.
This place here.
Yeah, these are actually the best seats because there's But which other Arab countries sent troops to fight against Saddam Hussein in 1991? And I don't mean the Gulf Arab states. There was the Egyptians who were part of it. Who else? Anybody? Huh? Arab country. Syria. Syria sent part of a military force to go and fight in there. So come back, number 4 was Syria, remember? The great revolutionary Syria, we'll come back to Syria. Okay. So in the period when things were testy for Mubarak, the Americans sent Frank Wisner Jr. Frank Wisner Jr. came basically to extend Mubarak's tenure. Is there any way to keep him in office and make some concessions to the public? What were the Americans afraid of? Why were they doing this kind of thing? Why did Sarkozy send people to Ben Ali and try to keep Ben Ali's tenure extended? They didn't want these people to leave. What is their problem? There are some basic coordinates of American policy and European policy as well that one has to bear in mind. Obviously, the straightforward answer is oil. But to be fair to the Americans, they don't get most of their oil from the Gulf any longer. They get it from West Africa, they get it from South America. They've diversified their portfolio. So people then say, well, it's about oil prices. Or it's about China, keeping the screws up on the Gulf oil because Chinese are reliant. Fine. One is oil. Oil is a major part of the equation, but it's not sufficient. Second important thing is the politics of it. The Americans, ever since they lost Latin America to the basic command of US hegemony, have been terrified of losing geographical parts of the world. You know, it's like the game you played, those puzzles you had as a child. You lose Latin America, can't find it anymore. They don't want to lose the Arab world. They don't want to lose this, that. They're very careful. Foreign policy is extremely testy, which is why Obama made the so-called Cairo speech, trying to win the Arab masses over to the side of the Americans, after having lost them almost through Bush. That was the game. So the politics of it are very important. The Americans did not want to lose their hegemonic role in the region, and not only for themselves, but for their principal allies in the region. And that's where the two other main pillars of US foreign policy come in. One is oil, the other is political power. But then there are two very important pieces. One is their main ally is Israel, and Israel was terrified about the developments in the Arab Spring. I'll come to that in a second. The second one was the Gulf Arab states, who were also terrified about what was happening in the Arab Spring. Why was Israel terrified? Israel is a tiny country. I mean, I think Delhi is bigger than Israel. I think it's probably faster to go from the Mediterranean out to Jordan than to drive from one end of Delhi to the other. I mean, I know that traffic is an impediment, but it's a tiny little country. It bears disproportionate interest in the world. It's amazing. Such a small place in the world, we are all obsessed with Israel. And, you know, people say to me, you are an anti-Semite because you are obsessed with Israel. Because it's such a small place. I mean, it bears disproportionate role in not only Middle East history, also India. And later, if you want, we can talk about its role in India. Massive role. Disproportionate to its tiny size. If you look at Israel geographically and think of its borders, the border with Lebanon has never been secure. You know, there is a so-called UN interim force which has been there for now for 40 years. And who is the interim force? Bangladeshi boats that patrol the Mediterranean, Indian and Pakistani troops that walk up and down, you know, the heights there. I mean, I visited there and you see the troops, they have no idea what the hell they're doing there. You know, they're trying to maintain this border, which is, because Israel does not recognize Lebanon, and Lebanon does not recognize Israel. It's a hostile border. So that's a major border. Second border is the zone of occupation, which is the vast area in the West Bank colonized by Israel. And that, as you know, obviously is an unstable border. It always surprised me when Advani used to give these speeches saying we should take lessons from Israel in counter-terrorism because they have succeeded. What is this crazy definition of success? So that border totally unstable. The major land border was Egypt. And in 1979 at Camp David, it was the agreement with the Egyptian military that secured the major land border. That was a major territorial threat because the tanks would roll across the desert. And for that agreement, the Egyptians received $1.3 billion a year in military assistance from the United States. It's the best bribe the US government has ever paid, because from 1979 to the present, basically the Egyptian military has taken itself out of Israel's threat scenario. And then there's Syria, which I'll come back to later, part 4. Israel essentially, after 1979, has had no adversary on its border that it could not contain asymmetrically. Meaning, with the Egyptian army now bought off by American money, the Israelis were able, they had overwhelming force over the Lebanese, as they demonstrated in 1982 and in 2006, and they had asymmetrical domination of the Palestinians. Whenever they felt like it, they could bomb the hell out of them. You know, Operation Castle Edge. The Palestinians could not respond. I mean, what is a suicide bomber to the might of the Israeli armed engagement? When helicopter gunships can fly regularly over Gaza and target for killing anyone they please, including Sheikh Yassin, the old head of Hamas, in his wheelchair was wearing, boom, helicopter gunship fires. Nobody, there's no anti-aircraft thing. It's total asymmetrical domination. That asymmetrical domination of the Palestinians in Lebanon was afforded by the US brokered Israel-Egypt peace agreement. So when Mubarak was going to go, the Israelis recognized it's a major threat to the entire regime and its security calculations. Because now no longer they have asymmetrical domination over their partners. And you may remember that after Mubarak was thrown out of office, Nabil al-Arabi was the new defense minister. He's an old Nasserite type guy, now the head of the Arab League. Al Arabi allowed 2 ships to go up and across through the Suez Canal. And they were Iranian ships. One of them was a frigate and one was a supply ship. It's the first time Iranian militarized ships, or actually any Iranian carrier, has gone through the Suez Canal since the Iranian Revolution of 78-79. It's amazing. So the Israelis recognized this is a major threat. And you then will remember that a few weeks later there was an attack at the Israeli embassy in Cairo. So Israel was not pleased with the direction, the dynamic of the so-called Arab Spring. Gulf Arab states immediately knew this is a problem. I mean, again, let's go back. Saudi Arabia, Facebook site created for days of rage in Saudi Arabia. The creator of the site shot outside his house, dead. Nobody cared. There was no international outrage. Crackdown inside Saudi Arabia against activists, and then, of course, what they always do in Saudi Arabia, they go and open up the richy rich vault and throw some gold coins at the population. You know, you get this bursary, you get this subsidy, you get this thing, and try to placate the population with some transfer payments. Yemen, you can go, there's no time, but Yemen is a very interesting and complicated story, but it had to be managed. What the Saudis have never countenanced is democracy anywhere on the peninsula. Since 1979, their great adversary has been Iran, because they see Iran as propagating so-called egalitarianism. So Bahrain, for instance, has been since 1979 the test case of the Saudi clampdown. You know, when Wifaq party was formed, there was an attempt to have some constitutional movement in Bahrain. It's a tiny country. It's a tiny country. It's a lifeline to the world in terms of as a causeway that goes to Saudi Arabia. In fact, recently there have been calls for the union of Bahrain into Saudi Arabia. But the Al Khalifa family is proud. You know, they are older than the Saudi royal family. They don't want to be obliterated. But there is this talk about it. Right after the Iranian Revolution, the Gulf Arab states created the so-called Arab NATO, the Gulf Coordination Council, the GCC, what the Iranians call the Persian Gulf Coordination Council. So they formed the so-called Arab NATO to prevent any kind of democratic initiative on the peninsula. So when Bahrain broke out, very brave struggle, led by people in Al-Wifaq, but also Bahrain Center for Human Rights, also all kinds of new movements, new social identities. People had wanted that constitution to be realized. The demonstration that took place in Bahrain in January or February was on the anniversary of their constitution. It had to do with their own history. We'll come to Libya, it's exactly the same. It had to do with their own history as well. That had to be crushed. We'll come back to that in a second. So these are the 4 reasons why America has a big problem. Oil, power, Israel, and the Gulf royal families. The great democrats of the region. Don't forget, when Mubarak was tottering, the Americans sent an envoy to Riyadh to discuss with the Saudis about the democratic transition in Egypt. Which, you know, I mean, nobody has shame in that world. They are such scoundrels. In fact, the guy who is the enemy of progress in the region, Jeffrey Feltman, he was US ambassador to Lebanon, has now been made the Under-Secretary of Political Affairs at the United Nations, which is just a travesty for the UN. He's just a right-wing scumbag. He's now a senior political officer in the United Nations. It's a travesty. Third, Libya. Anybody who believes that Gaddafi was a great hero is living in a time warp, basically. And one of the big parts of this book is detailing the Gaddafi of old and how from the 80s they lost the plot. I mean, in the 80s, what happened essentially was that the Libyan economy went into stagnation. And in order to free things up, Gaddafi had to make amends for his bad ways. And there he tasks the very sophisticated man, Mr. Musa Kusa, to go out there and make amends with the rest of the world. And this is the same guy who, when he was ambassador to London, gave a speech once where he said, all dogs must be killed. And he was promptly expelled by the British. Because, you know, the British have very high standards. They are against assassination and They don't talk like dogs, and they are against racism. So they just expelled Musa Kuza. He returns to Libya. Now, interestingly, he then becomes the guy Gaddafi entrusts to go and give money. So the British are happy to welcome him back because he had suitcases of cash for Lockerbie, suitcases of cash for the French plane that went down in Gabon, I think. He went around paying blood money because they knew the UN sanctions had to be removed. It was crippling the Libyan economy. And in the 1990s, Saif al-Islam Gaddafi became the point person for the neoliberalization of Libya, and he brought the Libyan diaspora back, including people who used to work at Goldman Sachs, who worked at, who worked in the Gulf, like for instance Mahmoud Jibril, the great current hero of Libya. Jibril was the financial advisor for the Sheikh of Qatar. He was a big-time financier in Beirut. This is the Libyan diaspora at the high end. These people returned in the 1990s to work with Saif al-Islam to liberalize Libya further. And Saif very nicely said he wanted to make Kuwait on the Mediterranean. That was their ambition. So those who believe that, Gaddafi of old, that beautiful man, 1969 when he was 20-some years old, 28 years old, stood there, when he did his coup, there was no resistance. It was a totally bloodless coup. But they really messed things up. I mean, just as many of the national liberation projects lost the plot, they lost the plot cataclysmically. So, that was not all about Libya. Then comes the crackdowns, the use of prisons for torture and all that. 1996, there was an Islamist uprising in eastern Libya. And in the prisons, one of the gangsters of the Gaddafi regime, who played a role in cracking down even in 2011, they went into the prison and they fired at the prisoners and they killed hundreds of people. That's one incident, one event. That event created a movement in Libya of human rights activists. And those people are very important. These are liberal people produced by the Gaddafi era national universities. They are products of the Gaddafi revolution. But they understood something is wrong here. The milk is sour. They understood something was wrong. That's one. Secondly, there was the Danish cartoon controversy, which you may remember. So in 2006, in Benghazi, there was a demonstration against the cartoon controversy. Once again, unimaginative Gaddafi regime, bang, bang. Now Gaddafi, who painted himself with the mantle of the prophet, asked his troops to fire at a demonstration against the Danish cartoon controversy. Very complicated situation. So remember that. That was in February of 2006. February 15, 2011 was to be the 5th year anniversary of that shooting. And the 1996 human rights people and all various people were going to demonstrate in Benghazi. The night before the demonstration, they arrested 3 activists, including one Fateh Terbil, very interesting man. They arrested them. And next day, big demonstration in Benghazi. Within 10 days, 1/3 of Libya was lost to the regime. Within 10 days. Nothing like that happened in any of the countries of the Arab Spring. The hold of the Gaddafi regime was brittle. Okay, now the rebellion was gaining full steam ahead. Brigadiers were defecting, aircraft were defecting. The rebels had bombed a Gaddafi ship in the Gulf of Sidra. 2 planes, warplanes flew from Benghazi airport. I mean, it was amazing. How did this idea come suddenly that there's going to be genocide if the West does not intervene? That is the trick. The whole thing of my book is on that question. Where did it come that 10,000 people were massacred? Or 10,000 injured? Some people were saying 3,000 massacred. Where did this come from? There is a website run by a media company which is owned by the Hariri family of Lebanon and the Saudi royal family, and that is Al Arabiya. And Al Arabiya started sending out these messages, 10,000 dead, 10,000 to be killed. Gaddafi is moving on Misrata. Now, if you look back, and what I did was I went back and I looked at the day-to-day happenings. I made a long timeline and I did day-to-day. What happened on March 1st? What happened on March 2nd? You know, looking at Al Jazeera, Al Arabiya, all the press accounts, talking to people on the ground as much as I could, all the accounts I could see. What was happening? Along the Mediterranean road, Gaddafi came in, smashed the rebels, came up to the gates of the city, could not enter. Shelled the city, then the rebels advanced, Gaddafi people moved back. They were going up and down along the Mediterranean road. You know, if you have a historical understanding of fights in North Africa, you may remember the war in Chad in 1987. Similar strategy. Gaddafi's people came in small Toyota trucks. They had machine guns manned on the front, rocket launchers, and they drove around the desert, and they were obliterated by the Chad army because the French Air Force came in and supported the Chad army. Okay, so similar thing was happening here, but the rebels had the initiative without question. There were so many defections. Syria, one general has defected. Very few corps commanders have defected. That is, people who command units have defected. In Libya, the difference is brigadiers were defecting. Captains were defecting. That means they were bringing corps commands with them. Separate from. The problem for the rebels was that you have to understand Libya itself. Libya is not a country. Libya is an archipelago of cities. So the corps commands didn't go and become the rebel army. They became the Misrata militia. They became the Zintan militia. They became Benghazi militia. But these are trained fighters. Alongside them were fighting the Islamists. That's the other Libyan diaspora. They didn't come in during Saif al-Islam's time to head up the central bank and all that. These fellows were in Chechnya. They were in Afghanistan. They were fighting in Iraq. They were fighting in, in some of them in Palestine. These were hardened fighters. These are the fellows with one eye, 6 fingers gone. Okay, blast. These are some really serious chaps. People like Belhaj. These are the serious experience. These are not the Libyans who came in Armani suits, who can speak French, etc. These fellows can't speak any languages. Their face has a bomb in it. They were fighters. So they were fighting. How is it then that this thing, Al Arabiya starts, human rights groups start to come in, and bizarre things happen. The role of Navi Pillay at the Human Rights Council is very questionable. Navi Pillay started to say immediately, something has to be done. In that inimitable style of us, something has to be done, cannot sit idle. By the way, when millions of people died in the Congo over the last 15 years, maybe 8 to 10 million people were killed in the so-called Fourth World War in the Congo. I never saw Navi Pillay in the big hall in Geneva coming out and saying, got to do something, it's a crime, it's a shame, nothing. Okay? But so many grievous massacres, for instance, Iraq War, grievous bombardment using, depleted uranium. The UN Human Rights Council never opened a session and said, let's discuss Afghanistan, let's discuss drone killing. That was a special rapporteur on extrajudicial killing, Philip Alston, who investigated that. But the Human Rights Council never took any position adverse to the interests of the United States and Europe. They didn't raise those questions. But she started saying, got to do something. I agree, got to do something. What do? I mean, what should have happened is that Tahrir should have sent 2 columns of people to join the rebels. That would have been authentic at least. Instead, this talk of intervention by the West started. And there we come to the trick of the peace, which is the deal that the Saudis conducted to enter Bahrain. And that is a very, I tell the story here. It's a very interesting story. You have to have some understanding of what the Arab League is. The Arab League is not an organization. It's 2 different coalitions. Some days one group comes, some day another group comes. Here, only about half the members showed up for the meeting. And I'll tell you why that's important. Half the members showed up. They voted for intervention in Libya. Their vote inside the Arab League was crucial in the UN. Nonetheless, Russia, China, India, Germany, and South Africa, no, sorry, not South Africa, Russia, India, China, Germany abstained. South Africa, the last minute voted with, because apparently Jacob Zuma got a call from Obama. And who can say no to Obama? I mean, Obama calls Jacob Zuma, the whole BRICS thing went out of the window. They were all meant to stand together. So they abstained. They abstained because that resolution was under Charter 7. And that is why China and Russia vetoed this current resolution. It's also under Charter 7. Charter 7, Article 7 in the UN Charter, Article 7, not Charter 7, Article 7 in the UN Charter allows military intervention by member states. Now, you know that member states means either NATO or the United States. Nobody else can intervene militarily. Nobody has a capacity. So when you say when a resolution is member state, it means the West will guide the military project. That deal was very important. And NATO began its bombardment in Libya. It hastened the war, maybe. We don't know that. But what it certainly did is strengthen the hand of the Libyan diaspora that wears Armani, not the one-eyed fellows. And that produces a kind of grammar that leads to this election result. I'm not going to get into that, but it's very interesting how this result comes. To have said that this is a milestone because Libya didn't go the Islamist route is to miss too much underneath why this happened. What was the nature of the electoral system that was devised? Why a majority of seats were individuals and couldn't be fought by the parties? Why the Islamists could not fight as a party? They had to create a front. These are all very important questions. Who decided these things? Who ran the process of creating the election? In the Rixos Hotel, why was the Democratic Party's Research Institute holding seminars, over the last 3 months on how to conduct an election? Okay, who devised the election methodology? It was not devised by them in Egypt, it was not devised by them in Tunisia, but they were very involved on the ground in devising the electoral strategy to create the new parliament. Okay, the majority of seats are not to be held by parties, which favors a certain kind of political ambition, certain kind of political direction. That's Libya. Entered from maybe October, I wrote an article first in an American periodical saying, why isn't NATO allowing an evaluation? That's the formal UN term of its action under UN Resolution 1973. That horse I've been trying to beat. I talked to the Indian ambassador in New York, Hardeep Puri. I did an interview with him for Frontline. In the Frontline interview, he said there should be an evaluation. Meanwhile, India just voted for Article 7 resolution on Syria. Even though Puri has been giving all these speeches against responsibility to protect, the Indian government is terrified of the Kashmir scenario. That's why India is uncomfortable with responsibility to protect. But nobody is willing to say, let us evaluate NATO. NATO has forbidden twice an investigation of how they conducted the war in Libya. So how do you know, what methodology do you know by which you can say that aerial bombardment helps save lives against a massacre that might have happened? For future reference, it's important to do an investigation. So when I went back and looked at the numbers, where Al Arabiya was saying 5,000 dead, 10,000 dead, I looked at Human Rights Watch retrospective numbers, medical numbers in Libya, and amnesty numbers, and I found two very interesting things. Where they were saying 6,000 injured, 3,000 dead, official figures 243. Let's say it's under report. It's nowhere near 3,000, 4,000. Second thing I found, which was interesting, is disproportionate number of men killed in the figures. This is revealing. If you're bombing civilian areas, you don't get disproportionate male death. You get close to the demographic question there. There will be many more children as well in the casualty numbers. So something was wrong in the way the story was being told beforehand. The third point about this evaluation question, one is that NATO refused evaluation. We don't know whether it was better that NATO intervened or it created worse results. Secondly, as I say, the numbers seem to be curious. The numbers don't seem to suggest that there was indiscriminate shelling into civilian areas, which by the way I don't believe that Gaddafi wouldn't do. He was perfectly capable of bombing civilian areas. It's not that he wouldn't, but the numbers don't suggest that that is what happened. Third thing that's, to my mind, important in this is if you take the case of these kind of involvements, these massive bombardment kind of involvements, you have to take, I think, a step back as well and say, who runs them? This was not run under NATO, under UN command. It was run under NATO command. They have certain objectives. Why did they not want to see, why did they not put pressure on the various militias to form a unified command? Why did they allow militias to go fighting in their own areas? See, if the ground war had continued, without NATO intervention, invariably a kind of politics would have been clarified on the ground. People would have to figure out a way to deal with each other. Some modus vivendi had to be created between Misrata, all the cities would have to negotiate, create a proper political platform. But since NATO intervened, the politics was set aside. So what you then inherit is a society right now where there is no unified military command, where every city has its own militia, where lawlessness is pretty rampant in the cities, and the politics of it are not clear. That is, the actual rebels who fought on the ground don't have a political platform from which to have run in this election. The only people who came with a political platform were the Libyan diaspora, people like Jibril. They will return to the platform. That's a third thing. When you have outside intervention, it inks the politics in a certain way. The politics get written in a certain way. So that's Libya. Okay, that's the third. Fourth, Syria. Again, anybody who believes that the Syrian Ba'ath regime is a progressive regime has their head in the clouds. I mean, it's totally outside the level of empirical fact. Okay, let's deal with some of the main issues. Firstly, it's a Ba'ath regime. It's not a left-wing regime. The Ba'athists considered themselves progressive nationalists at one time, a long time ago. When Flak was writing, he thought of himself as a progressive nationalist. That was a long time ago. When the Ba'ath regime comes to power in Syria, they smash the Communist Party. And then, just as Saddam Hussein do, they take one section of the Communist Party and they make it the domestic animal. So the Syrian Communist Party today is not a Communist Party. It essentially is like when anytime the Assad family wants to appear progressive, they front them out. But it's not an authentic, independent at all organization. It's basically a way to have, when it's useful, to push this up. That's one. Secondly, Syria is the great bulwark against Zionism. Total bogus. Now, obviously, Syria plays an important role as conduit for arms to Hezbollah and things like that. Hezbollah plays a very important role in Lebanon. All that is true. But remember, I said there's one border region left, which I said I'll talk about later, the Golan Heights in that region. Syria, since at least the 1960s, has acted as the border guard for Israel. There has been nothing allowed at the Golan region. No martyrdom operations were allowed from there. Okay, that they had to go through the occupied territories. They were not able to get through Syria. Forget it, that was closed. Secondly, the way Syria tried to utilize Hezbollah and the way Syria crushed the Palestinian left in Beirut is worthy of being remembered. You talk to Palestinian leftists, they will tell you, they remember the 1975 civil war period and afterwards when the Syrian army comes in. They crushed the Palestinian left. It's also true that Palestinian left-wing groups and Hamas create offices in Syria. It's also true. George Habash, for instance, the leader of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, was based in Damascus. But that doesn't mean that he was helped by the Syrian regime. The Syrian regime was compelled to allow these people to have exile there. But they were not helped by it. Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine also had an office there. They were not helped by the Syrian regime. By the way, all kinds of Islamists were also allowed to have offices there, including Hamas, at the same time as the Assad regime was crushing domestic Islamist groups. So there is no commitment to those organizations just because they gave them an address. You know what I mean? Just when he's bombing Hama, he allowed Islamists to create offices as long as they are doing their activities elsewhere, but not inside Syria. So that's the second. This is not an anti-Zionist regime. When it suited them, they trot out the language of Israel. But that's basically rhetorical. They have done nothing to help, put pressure on Israel. Third thing is, as I said, they have colluded with imperialism for at least 3 decades. 1991 Gulf War, Syrian army was there in Kuwait, going up the road towards Baghdad. If they were allowed, they would have gone all the way. That general, by the way, I was asking friends in Damascus, what happened to him? Because if the Americans are in touch with anybody in the military, this guy is a perfect candidate. He was dead within a few months of the rebellion, so that was over. Anyway, so then, as I said, the jails of Syria were open to extraordinary rendition prisoners. So in no way, in these respects, political respects, is Syria an advanced, progressive country. The fourth reason is from the 1990s, the Assad regime opened the doors to private capital, and a crony capitalist sector has grown up around the Assad family, but also beyond it. And that's one reason why there's a lot of dissatisfaction even in Damascus against the ruling family. By the way, if you read the wiki release of the Syrian material, it's fantastic. You get a sense of the kind of world they live in and the kind of capital connections that they have. You know, they are very integrated, trying to rebuild Syria's role as a kind of central financial thing. It didn't quite work, but that was part of the agenda. And my friend Bassam Haddad has written the best book demonstrating the close fraternal links between the Assad regime and this neoliberal crony capitalist clique that surrounded it. So those are the 4 reasons. For 11 months in Syria, after January, that is from January to November, 11 months, there were peaceful demonstrations in Syria. You cannot say that this is a Saudi plot. You cannot say this is an American plot. 11 months they were there getting smashed. Who were these people? Young Marxists, young Islamists. My old friend Salameh Khalife, 56-year-old Marxist Palestinian intellectual based in Damascus, once again arrested. He was arrested and spent 9 years as a guest of the Assad family in the worst prisons. He was arrested again in 2011. 56 years old should not be beaten. Correct? They beat him with pipes. And then the war ironies, they deported him to Jordan. He's a Palestinian, and then there he of course said, look at my bruises all over my body, electric shock, this, that. These are the people protesting. The Israelis do not want the Assad regime to fall. That is just there. That it would be catastrophic. Because they know if Assad falls and if Syria is a client state of Saudi Arabia is a deeply duplicitous country in terms of politics. They will not also be able to control if the Ikhwan come to power in Damascus. If you have a brotherhood government in Egypt, a brotherhood government in Syria, you have lunacy in Lebanon because you never know what's going to happen. You know, in Lebanon already Sunni extremist groups are organizing against Hezbollah. There have been many little shootouts already happening. If you have Israel encircled now by Islamist political forces, they will be terrified. So they do not want Syria to go. And you know, the catchphrases in this is the State Department is very uneasy with what they call precipitous collapse of the Assad regime. NATO's Anders Fogh Rasmussen has 3 or 4 times given public statements saying, we don't want to get involved here. It is different to fight in Libya as to Syria. It's very convenient, therefore, to say the Russians and Chinese don't want to allow the Syrian people to breathe. The fact is, nobody wants to allow the Syrian people to breathe. Everybody is colluding to prevent what I think inevitably will happen, which is the Assad regime is going to fall. Inevitably, that's going to happen. Why Arab Spring Libyan return? There is an authentic spring. This is not a CIA plot. It's not inspired by Facebook. It's a real popular struggle. For so many years, we have been asking Arabs, what's wrong with you people? So many bloody years you're living under these barbaric people. Okay, fine. Imagine, by the way, if Indira Gandhi was still alive and she was still in power and never lost an election. You know, Indira Gandhi comes to power first, what, 69? 69? So that's pretty much where Mubarakism begins. Then Ali closer, 69 to today. Imagine. Without any change, Indira Gandhi.
Sanjay Gandhi alive.
Sanjay Gandhi alive. As her Gamal Mubarak. Because he would be the real neoliberal.
Yeah.
Rajiv Gandhi was too clueless to be a genuine neoliberal. He used to just get angry at Manmohan Singh. Sanjay Gandhi was a Sadi Ali was a gangster, a true gangster. Also inspirational gangster, because he could rile up people. But he's not that kind of backroom gangster. Gamal Mubarak was a backroom gangster. So this would have been worse, infinitely worse. We used to say, what's wrong with you Arabs? They used to always say things like, here nothing comes in half measures. They'd never eaten Bengali sweets, but they would say things like, if you taste the baklava, how sweet it is. It's more sweet than saying, I'd say, you just eat one of these Bengali, you have no idea what. So they would say that. And indeed, this is an authentic thing. You should always be curious why people say it comes from outside. You have no faith in people. People are capable. That doesn't mean they know always what they're doing. But they're doing, yeah. You just have to go with it for a little bit. Then you have to know why it's a Libyan winter. But that doesn't mean that Libya is the problem. Somebody wrote to me a nasty email saying, look, you misunderstood the whole Libya thing, there was an election. So firstly, the Libyan winter isn't about Libya. It's about the attempt to create winter through Libya. And Bahrain certainly has experienced the Libyan winter. Yemen certainly has experienced the Libyan winter. Saudi Arabia will only have a Libyan winter. And luckily for Saudi Arabia, the only way it has progress is when people die. Because the worst guy became the crown prince in the middle of all this. Nayef. Fortunately, he died. He would have been the most reactionary king in a country that's famous for reactionary kings. And luckily, he died recently. So Saudi Arabia at least says the only way progress happens there is when the princes die. Then you get a new person. But I want to say one last thing before I open, and that is the Arab League. In the Arab League, you might say, oh, you are a conspiracy theorist, liberty of the Arab League votes, what kind of nonsense is this? Interesting. When the Arab League had to have an election after after the guy who was, what's his name, he ran for office for president of Egypt, Aman Musa left to go and run for office in Egypt. By the way, that's another great story. Egyptian polling. They talked to people who live in Heliopolis, and they all wanted Aman Musa, they wanted El Baradei, they wanted all these people, but there is no popular backing for them. Polling agencies weren't going to Alexandria, Port Said, places. Anyway, when Aman Musa left the Arab League, Qatari was put forward to be the next General Secretary of the Arab League. But he lost the election. Because the other faction, Algeria and all of them, were furious with the Gulf Arabs. And instead they put Nabil al-Arabi, who was the first foreign minister of the new post-Mubarak regime. It's a very interesting signal of the deep divides, continuing divides in the Arab world. The game is not up. So even though Arab Spring